I never thought the day would come when my own son would slide a folder across my kitchen table and tell me it was time to simplify things. But there was my son, Philip, sitting in the chair where his father used to drink his morning coffee, using words like equity and transition, and what's best for everyone. While my daughter-in-law, Renee, stood in the doorway pretending to study her fingernails. I looked at that folder. Then I looked at the window above the sink, where my late husband Walter's bird feeder still hung from the oak branch, still full because I filled it every Sunday morning the way he always did. Before we go any further, I said quietly, let me remind you both whose name is on this deed, but I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how we got to that moment, you need to know where we started. My name is June. I'm 68 years old. I spent 31 years as an administrative coordinator at a regional hospital in central Ohio, and before that, I raised 2 children, kept a house, and stood beside my husband, Walter, through everything life threw at us, which, I can tell you, was considerable. Walter was a high school history teacher. He wore corduroy jackets with the elbows worn through, drove the same Ford pickup for 19 years, and had a laugh that started somewhere deep in his chest and finished in his eyes. We bought our house on Clover Mill Road in 1989 for $84,000, which felt terrifying at the time. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a detached garage that leaned slightly to the left, and a backyard that backed up to a little creek. The kind of house that doesn't impress anyone on first glance, but becomes the most important place in the world after you've lived there long enough. We planted a vegetable garden the first summer. The tomatoes failed. The zucchini took over everything. By August, we were leaving bags of zucchini on neighbors' porches in the dark like we were committing a crime, and somehow that became the funniest story we told for years afterward. Our son Philip was 7 when we moved in. Our daughter Tamara was 4. They grew up in that house in the ordinary, irreplaceable way children do. School pictures on the hallway wall, height marks penciled on the pantry doorframe, the particular smell of Sunday dinners that seemed to soak into the walls over decades. I don't know how to explain the feeling of a home to someone who has only ever lived somewhere. A home is different. A home remembers you. Walter retired in 2016. We had plans, modest ones, because we were modest people. A road trip out west, something we'd talked about for 20 years. A screened-in porch on the back of the house. More time in the garden. More Saturday mornings doing exactly nothing in a way that felt luxurious rather than lazy. Then in the spring of 2019, Walter started losing weight he didn't intend to lose. By June we had a diagnosis. By August we understood what it meant. I won't spend long on those months because I still can't spend long on them. What I'll say is this. Walter faced everything with the same quiet steadiness he brought to teaching, to fatherhood, to 39 years of marriage. He was not a dramatic man. He did not rage. He organized things. He made lists. He called our attorney, a woman named Sandra Whitfield, who had handled our wills and property documents for over a decade, and he asked her to meet with us. I remember sitting across from Sandra in her office on a rainy November afternoon, half listening while she and Walter discussed updates to the trust documentation. My mind kept drifting to the bird feeder. I'd forgotten to fill it that morning. Walter reached across and squeezed my hand without looking away from the papers. Before he died, in the quiet of the bedroom we'd shared since Reagan was president, he told me several things. He told me where the spare key to the safety deposit box was hidden. He told me the bird feeder needed new perches by spring. And then he held my hand the way he had on our wedding day, and said something that didn't fully make sense to me until much later. June, he said, I talked to Sandra about everything. The house is protected. Don't let anyone rush you. And if something ever feels wrong, I mean in your gut, the way you always know, call Sandra before you do anything else. Why would something feel wrong? I asked. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Because grief makes people see opportunities, he said, even people who love you. I didn't want to think about what he meant, so I told him I understood, and I held his hand until he fell asleep. He passed 11 days later. For the first year, I managed. That's the honest word for it. Managed, not thrived, not flourished, not any of the words the grief pamphlets use. I got up in the mornings. I filled the bird feeder. I went to the grocery store and came home and cooked dinner for one, which is a strange and humbling exercise no one warns you about. My neighbor Darlene Hutchins came by twice a week, and we drank coffee, and sometimes just sat without talking, which is its own form of kindness. Philip called on Sundays. Tamara called whenever she could, which was often, because that's the kind of daughter she was. She lived in Colorado with her husband and their 2 girls, and she couldn't be here physically. But she was present in every way that counted. Philip lived 40 minutes away with his wife Renee and their teenage son Cooper. They visited monthly, sometimes more. Renee always brought something: a casserole, a candle, flowers from the farmer's market. She was attentive in the way that a certain kind of person is attentive, performing care for the room. I noticed small things about Renee that I tucked away and tried not to think about. The way her eyes moved around my living room when she thought I wasn't watching. The way she made comments framed as compliments. This neighborhood has really held up. This square footage is just so practical. You must rattle around in here all by yourself. Comments that were shaped like concern but felt like assessment. Philip didn't notice, or if he did, he'd learned not to say so. My son was a good man. I want to be clear about that because this story could make him sound otherwise. And the truth is more complicated than a villain. Philip was kind and hard-working and genuinely loved me. He also had a weakness I recognized because his father had warned me about it years ago, sitting on the back porch one summer evening. Philip deferred. To employers, to authority, and especially to Renee. He loved her, which meant he trusted her version of things, which meant he sometimes stopped seeing what was actually in front of him. The first real warning came from Darlene. She stopped me in the driveway one October morning, her terrier Otto pulling at his leash toward the creek path. "Your daughter-in-law asked me something yesterday," she said. I waited. She wanted to know what the Parkers got for their place. The Parkers had sold their house 2 streets over in the summer. It was a question with a specific gravity, the kind of question that sounds casual but isn't. Maybe she was just curious, I offered. Darlene looked at me over her reading glasses. She was 72 and had worked 30 years as a school librarian. She was not a woman who missed things. She also asked whether I thought the new development on Route 9 would bring property values up. We stood there in the driveway for a moment. "I'm not trying to make trouble," Darlene said. "I just think you should know." That evening, Philip called, and his voice had a particular warmth that I'd learned to recognize. The warmth he used when he was about to say something he'd rehearsed. "Mom, Renee and I have been talking," he started. There it was. "We hate thinking about you out there alone, especially with winter coming." A pause. "We were thinking, what if we came to stay for a while just to help? Cooper could have his old room back. It would be good for all of us, Cooper's old room. He'd stayed there exactly 4 times. But I was lonely. That's the truth I'm not ashamed of. I was lonely in the way that a quiet house becomes a weight after decades of noise. And when your child tells you he wants to come home, some part of you opens the door before the rest of you has a chance to think. "All right," I said. "Let's try it." They arrived on a Saturday in November with 2 cars, a rented van, and Cooper, who was 16 and seemed genuinely happy to see me. He hugged me in the driveway for a long time, his chin on top of my head. "Grandma June," he said. "You look good. You look tall," I told him. "I am tall," he agreed, as though this were a recent development he was still getting used to. The first 2 weeks were almost exactly what I'd hoped for. Philip fixed the gutter I'd been avoiding. Renee reorganized my pantry, which I hadn't asked her to do but didn't object to. Cooper came downstairs in the evenings and watched old game shows with me and asked surprisingly thoughtful questions about what life was like before the internet. The house had sound again. Footsteps on the stairs, dishes in the sink, the smell of someone else's coffee. Then things began to shift. Not dramatically. That's the thing about this kind of erosion. It happens at a pace that's easy to dismiss, because any single moment seems small enough to let go. Renee moved the furniture in the living room. "Better flow," she explained. Walter's recliner ended up in the corner by the coat closet, turned slightly away from the window where he used to watch the yard. The welcome mat I'd had for 12 years. A plain brown thing Walter had bought at the hardware store disappeared. A new one appeared. Gray with a geometric pattern. Small things. Then one afternoon I came home from a doctor's appointment to find Renee on the phone in the kitchen, leaning against the counter with that particular ease of a person who believes the room belongs to her. "We're still getting settled," she was saying. "But I think once we make a few updates, the whole feel of the place will really change." I stood in the doorway. She turned, saw me, and finished the call without hurry. "Just my friend Kristen," she said. She was asking how we're adjusting. "What kind of updates?" I asked. Renee smiled the way people smile when they think you've asked a simple question. "Nothing major, just freshening things up." I looked around my kitchen. Walter and I had repainted it ourselves in 2014, a soft yellow that he'd picked from a sample strip and held up against the morning light for 10 minutes before deciding. "I like how it looks," I said. "Of course," Renee said. She turned back to the counter. The subject was closed, as far as she was concerned. That night, I lay awake and heard his voice as clearly as if he were still beside me. "Don't let anyone rush you." The next morning, I got up early and called Sandra Whitfield. "I'm probably being paranoid," I said. "Describe paranoid to me," Sandra said. I told her about Renee's phone call, about Darlene's conversation, about the way Renee's eyes moved around rooms like she was taking inventory. Sandra was quiet for a moment. "June, do you remember when Walter came in to see me about 2 years before he passed?" I said I remembered. "He asked me to make some very specific updates to your property documents. I explained everything at the time, but you were going through a great deal." A pause. The short version is that Walter was thorough. More thorough than most people realize. What does that mean? It means the property is protected in ways that would be very difficult to work around without your direct participation. It means you don't need to be afraid. "But I do think," she said carefully, "that you should keep your eyes open." I drove home from the pharmacy that afternoon feeling something I hadn't felt in months. Not exactly strong, not exactly safe, but aware. Alert in the way you get when the fog lifts and you realize the road has been curving this whole time. 2 weeks later, Phillip brought Renee to what he called a family conversation. They sat across from me at the dining room table, the same table where I'd signed tax returns and birthday cards and homework permission slips for 30 years. Phillip had his hands folded the way he used to sit before piano recitals as a boy. Renee had a folder. "Mom," Phillip started, "we just want to talk about the future." I nodded. He talked about my age, about the house being a lot to maintain, about how he and Renee worried about me handling everything alone, about how financially it might make more sense to simplify. "Simplify how?" I asked. Renee, inside were documents, property assessments, a market analysis, what looked like preliminary listing materials. I stared at them. "We're not pressuring you," Renee said, in the tone of a person who absolutely is. "This is your home," Phillip added, and I noticed the word "your" where he might have said "our," and I wondered when the distinction had started mattering to him. "We just think," Renee said, "that if you signed a financial power of attorney, we could start managing things more efficiently. And then, down the road, maybe consider a community that would be better suited to." "A community," I said. "Independent living." Renee smiled. "There's a wonderful place about 20 minutes from us. We could visit all the time." I looked at my son. He met my eyes for a moment, then looked at the table. "Phillip," I said quietly, "is this what you want?" He didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. "We want you to be safe," he said finally. I nodded. I looked at the documents on the table. I kept my voice very even. "I'll think about it," I said. Renee relaxed. She must have thought that meant yes. That evening, after they went upstairs, I sat at the kitchen table alone. Through the window, the bird feeder swayed in the November wind. I thought about Walter filling it, on Sunday mornings, in his old flannel shirt, the way he talked to the birds like they could hear him, the way he talked to me the same way. I got up and went to the closet in my bedroom where I kept a metal file box on the top shelf. Walter had put it there. I had the key on my keychain, where it had been for 3 years without my ever needing it. I opened the box. Inside, beside the property documents and the insurance papers, and the copy of our will, was an envelope. My name on the front in Walter's handwriting. The same careful print he used for lesson plans, for grocery lists, for the birthday cards he always wrote himself rather than just signing his name. I sat on the edge of the bed and held it. I didn't open it that night. I needed one more night of not knowing, because some part of me already knew. The next morning, Cooper knocked on my bedroom door before school. "Grandma June? Come in." He sat on the chair by the window, his backpack on his lap. He was wearing a hoodie 3 sizes too big and had the slightly stunned look of someone who hadn't quite become himself yet. I loved him very much for that. We talked about his English class, about a history project he was working on, about a girl at school he mentioned twice without seeming to notice he'd done it. Then he looked at his hands. "Grandma," he said, "can I tell you something?" "Of course. I heard my parents talking last night." He picked at a thread on his sleeve. Dad was saying he wasn't sure anymore, that this felt like it was going too far. My heart shifted. "What did your mother say?" Cooper looked up. She said they didn't have a choice. The room was very quiet. She said if they didn't figure something out soon, they were going to lose everything. He swallowed. "She wasn't talking about you. She was talking about them." I looked at my grandson. He looked back at me the way young people do when they've just said something irreversible and don't know whether they've helped or made everything worse. "You did the right thing," I said. "Thank you." He left for school. I sat with what he'd told me and let it settle. Then I opened the envelope. Walter's handwriting covered 2 pages. The pen had pressed harder in some places than others, the way it always did when he was writing something he needed to get exactly right. "My dear June, if you're reading this, something has made you uncertain. That's all I need to know to understand why you're holding this letter. You have always seen the best in people first. I have always loved this about you. I have also always worried about it. The world has a particular way of treating women who see the best. It mistakes kindness for permission. The house is protected. Sandra knows everything. Before you sign anything, before you agree to anything, before you move 1 inch in a direction that doesn't feel right, call Sandra. This isn't about trusting less. It's about knowing what you're worth. You built something real. Don't let anyone tell you that real things need to be liquidated. Don't be afraid. You were never the kind of woman who needed anyone to carry her. You just needed someone to remind you sometimes. I love you, June. Phil the bird feeder." Walter read it 3 times. Then I sat very still for a long while. Not crying, not yet, just quiet, in the way you get when someone has given you back something you didn't know you'd lost. I called Sandra that afternoon. "I'm ready to understand the full picture," I said. "Then come in," she said. "Tomorrow morning, if you can." Sandra's office was on the 3rd floor of a brick building downtown, the kind of office that had been in the same place long enough to stop trying to look modern. She met me at the door and took my coat and brought coffee without asking how I took it, because she'd known me long enough to remember. She told me what Walter had done. 2 years before he passed, he had restructured the property protections in ways that went significantly beyond a standard will. The house could not be sold, transferred, refinanced, or placed under another party's control without my direct participation under very specific legal conditions. Independent counsel review. A separate verification process, a waiting period. No power of attorney, regardless of how it was worded, could bypass those requirements. "He was worried," Sandra said simply. "He didn't tell me how worried. He didn't want to scare you." She set down her coffee cup. "He also didn't want you to know the full extent of what he'd arranged, because he thought if you knew, you might try to simplify it for Philip's sake." That sounded exactly like Walter, and exactly like me. "There's one more thing," Sandra said. She slid a document across the desk, a record of correspondence. An inquiry from a financial consulting firm, dated 4 months ago, asking about property transfer procedures on behalf of a client. The client's name was listed as Renee Cartwright. I sat with that for a moment. "She contacted you directly." "Her office did. We declined to provide information and did not follow up." I thought about Phillip sitting across from me at the dining room table, hands folded, saying, "We want you to be safe." I thought about whether he had known. I thought about Cooper saying Dad wasn't sure. I thought about what it means to love someone who lets himself be led. What do I do now? I asked. Sandra looked at me steadily. You go home. You don't confront anyone yet. You let them keep talking. She folded her hands. People reveal the complete picture when they believe they've already won. I drove home slowly. The afternoon was gray and cold, and the highway was full of people going somewhere in a hurry. I thought about Walter buying this house with me when we were young and broke, and completely certain that love was enough to fix anything. I thought about all the Sundays in that kitchen, all the winter mornings, all the small ordinary moments that turn into a life before you notice. When I got home, Renee was at the kitchen table with her laptop. She looked up and smiled. Good errands, she asked. Very productive, I said. She nodded and turned back to her screen. I took off my coat, filled the bird feeder, and went to sit in Walter's recliner by the window. Over the next 2 weeks, I paid attention. Carefully, quietly. The way Walter had always said I could when I chose to. June, when you actually watch, you see everything. He wasn't wrong. Renee was on the phone more than usual. Short calls, voice dropped, walking to the far end of the yard. Philip watched her sometimes with an expression I recognized. It was the look of a man who had agreed to something, and was now watching it become more than he agreed to. He looked tired, a different tired than the kind that comes from work. One evening I was in the hallway and heard them in the bedroom. Philip's voice, Renee, I don't think we should keep pushing. Renee's voice, we don't have a choice. Silence. Silence. She's my mother. I know that. What we owe isn't her problem. Another silence. Longer. Philip. Her voice shifted into something quieter, harder. If we don't do something in the next 6 months, we're going to lose the business. You know that. I stood very still in the hallway. I don't want to do it this way, Philip said. Then think of another way. I moved away before either of them heard me. I went to the kitchen and stood at the window in the dark, looking at the bird feeder swaying on its branch. Money makes people unrecognizable. That was what Walter had said to me once, years ago, about someone else entirely. I'd thought he was being uncharitable. Now I understood he was being accurate. I called Darlene that night. I told her more than I'd planned to, because she was the kind of person who made you tell the truth without asking for it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, if it ever comes to needing a witness for anything, you know where I live. I do, I said. Thank you. Walter would have done the same, she said simply. The formal meeting happened on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks later. Renee organized it. She called it a family planning session, which is a phrase that sounds careful and reasonable, and made me feel the specific chill of something arriving that had already been decided. She had invited a woman named Christine Oler. Christine was a real estate agent. Her card said, residential and estate sales, in a font that tried very hard to look trustworthy. We sat in the living room. Philip on the couch beside Renee, Christine with a folder on the coffee table, Cooper in the armchair by the window, pulling at his sleeve. Sandra Whitfield arrived at 3 o'clock, right on time, because I had asked her to. Renee's face when Sandra walked through the door was something I will remember for a long time. Not panic. Something more careful than panic, the expression of a person recalculating. I wasn't aware we'd invited an attorney, Renee said. I invited her, I said. She's been my attorney for 15 years. Sandra sat beside me and opened her briefcase with the particular calm of someone who has done this before, and is not remotely concerned about what she'll find. Renee looked at Philip. He looked at his hands. Christine smiled in the polite, non-committal way of someone who has just realized she is in the wrong meeting. Sandra spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. I want to explain the legal landscape clearly, she said, so there are no misunderstandings going forward. She laid out the property protections Walter had established, clearly, methodically, without drama. The house could not be sold or transferred without specific legal protocols that no power of attorney could shortcut. Any attempt to do so would involve serious legal exposure for the parties attempting it. Renee said nothing. Then Sandra mentioned the inquiry her office had received, the one from Renee's consulting firm. The room went very quiet. Philip turned to look at Renee slowly. The way you turn when something has confirmed something you were afraid to confirm. Renee, he said. Her name only, nothing else. Renee looked at the coffee table. Then, Christine quietly began to put her papers back in her folder. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I looked at my son. He looked back at me, and for the first time in months, I could see him clearly. The boy who used to bring me dandelions like they were roses, the teenager who fell asleep at the kitchen table doing homework, the man who had somehow gotten lost, somewhere between his love for his wife and his responsibility to everyone else. "Philip," I said gently. He blinked. "I know you're in trouble." I said it quietly, so only he could hear. "I know this wasn't entirely your idea." His jaw tightened. His eyes filled, just slightly. "But you sat at this table and let it happen." I held his gaze. "You need to decide what kind of son you want to be from here." He didn't answer right away. He was a man who needed time to arrive at things, always had been. But something in his face shifted. Then Cooper stood up. He was 16 and wearing a hoodie with a stain on the sleeve, and he stood up like he was twice his age. "Mom," he said to Renee. His voice was steady. "Dad told you he didn't want to do this." Renee looked at him sharply. "Cooper, I heard you. I heard both of you." He wasn't angry, which somehow made it worse. He was just clear. "Grandma June has lived here my whole life. This is her home." He looked at Renee directly. "You knew that!" Renee said nothing. Cooper sat back down. He looked at me. I gave him the smallest nod I could manage, because anything more and I would have fallen apart right there in the living room. Christine excused herself. Sandra walked her out and returned with the professionalism of a woman who had seen harder rooms than this. What followed was not a clean confrontation. Real moments never are. Renee became defensive, then tearful, then honest in pieces, the way people are honest when they realize the alternative is worse. She told us about the business. A small events company she and Phillip had started 4 years ago that had never quite found its footing. She told us about the loans. She told us about the number, which was large enough to explain everything and break my heart at the same time. Phillip listened to her the way you listen to someone confirming something you already knew and were hoping wasn't true. When she finished, he looked at me. "I'm sorry, Mom." The words came out raw, unpolished, real. "I should have told you what was happening. I should have asked for help the right way." "The right way, not this way." "Yes," I said. "You should have." The silence that followed was the kind that families carry when the truth has finally arrived and nobody knows what to do with it yet. Sandra stayed another half hour and clarified the legal situation in terms that left no ambiguity. The house was mine. It would remain mine. Any decisions about its future would be made by me, in my own time, with independent counsel, the way Walter had intended. Renee and Phillip left the following week. Not because I asked them to. They asked to go. Renee needed to face the financial situation directly, she said. Phillip needed to stop letting her carry it alone, she said. They were both right. These were true things, even if they arrived late. Cooper asked if he could stay for the rest of the month. I said yes immediately, and meant it without reservation. He was good company, my grandson's son. He ate breakfast with me every morning. He asked me once about what Walter was like when Phillip was young, and I told him for an hour, and he didn't look at his phone once. He fixed the bird feeder perch in the backyard one Saturday afternoon, without being asked, climbing up on a step stool with a screwdriver while I stood below with my coffee. Grandpa Walter would have done this himself, he said. He would have talked to the birds the whole time, I told him. Cooper grinned. I could do that. I know you could, I said. Phillip called the week after they left. It was a different kind of call than the ones before. No warmth that had been rehearsed, no careful setup, just his voice. I need to tell you something, he said. Okay. Rennie reached out to Sandra's office before we ever asked to move in. A pause. I didn't know that until Sandra said it in the meeting. I want you to know I didn't know. I believed him, not blindly, because of the look on his face when Sandra had said it. I also want you to know that I knew something felt wrong, he said, and I didn't stop it. That's on me. Yes, I said. It is. Another pause. Mom, I know that's not enough, but I'm saying it anyway. I know, I said. We talked for a long time after that. Not about the house, not about money. About Walter. About the road trip we never took. About how strange it was that the things you plan the longest sometimes never happen. And the things you don't plan at all. The Sunday mornings, the burned zucchini, the 19-year-old pickup truck, turn out to be the whole story. It was a beginning, not the old beginning we'd had before things went wrong. A different one, more careful, more honest. Beginnings that come after damage are like that. They don't start from the same place. 3 months passed. Cooper went home after the holidays and texted me almost every day, mostly pictures of things he thought were funny or strange. Sometimes just a check-in that said, "How are you, Grandma June," in all lowercase, the way teenagers type when they actually mean something. Darlene and I resumed our twice-weekly coffees. Sandra filed the updated legal documents. I planted the garden in April. Tomatoes again. Because I'd been failing at tomatoes for 33 years. And it seemed important not to stop now. One evening in late spring, I sat on the back porch as the sun was going down behind the creek. The air smelled like grass and something sweet from the neighbor's flowering tree. The birds were making a racket at the feeder, the way they do in the hour before dark, when they're all rushing to finish what they started. I had Walter's letter on the table beside me, not because I needed to read it, because it felt like company. Phillip had called that morning. He and Renee had found a financial counselor. They were working through it. Slowly, honestly, the hard way, which is the only way things like that actually get worked through. It wasn't my job to fix it for them. He knew that now. Tamara was coming next month with the girls. We were going to attempt the tomatoes together and probably fail together, and that was exactly right. I looked out at the yard. Walter's yard. My yard. The yard where Phillip played as a boy, where the tomatoes failed every summer, where the maple tree had watched everything and said nothing, the way good witnesses do. Here is what I know, now that I didn't know a year ago. A home is not an asset. It is not equity, or square footage, or market value, or potential. It is the place where your life accumulated, year by year, in the way that only time can build something. You can price us. You cannot price a home. I also know this. Loving someone is not the same as protecting them from consequences. Phillip needed to face what he'd allowed. Ashley needed the same. Children who are loved unconditionally sometimes confuse that love with license. That is not cruelty. It is the oldest mistake in the oldest story. And I know, because Walter told me, because Sandra confirmed it, because I finally let myself believe it, that dignity is not something that disappears with age or grief or loneliness. It stays. It waits. It is still there when you finally decide to stand up and claim it. I picked up Walter's letter and folded it back along its lines. Then I went inside to fill the bird feeder before dark.